Hi there, I was just thinking about you. How have you been lately? People say Mother's Day is when a mother feels most cherished, but mine was the day I learned what it meant to be erased by my own family. I am Margaret Hayes, 64 years old, a widow who gave everything to raise her only son. That Sunday, I dressed with hope, believing love would be enough. Instead, I was led into a place that smelled of bleach and silence, with papers I had never signed and a suitcase I had never packed. I woke up that Sunday with a warmth in my chest that I had not felt in years. It was Mother's Day in Columbus, Ohio, and I told myself it was going to be a day filled with love. At 64, with my husband gone almost a decade, I still believed my son Daniel would want to celebrate with me. I set the table for 3, laid out the pancakes I had cooked, and put fresh tulips from my garden in a jar on the counter. I even ironed the pale blue blouse Richard had always loved on me. By 9:30, I heard a car pull up outside. I peeked through the curtain, and there he was, my only son, stepping out in a pressed shirt. For a brief second, my heart soared. Then Melissa stepped out of the passenger seat holding a bouquet of grocery store carnations wrapped in plastic. I brushed off the thought that they looked rushed, telling myself not to be petty. When they walked in, Daniel gave me a half hug and muttered, "Happy Mother's Day." Melissa handed me the bouquet with a smile that never reached her eyes. "Thank you," I said, and tucked the flowers into a vase. I waited for Daniel to mention brunch or church, or even just coffee together. Instead, Melissa looked at her watch. "We should get going." Going where, I asked, confused. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "It's a surprise, Mom. We want to take you somewhere special today." I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe they had reservations at that restaurant near the river I loved. I grabbed my purse and followed them to the car. Daniel opened the back door for me, his eyes avoiding mine. The drive was quiet. Melissa tapped on her phone. Daniel kept his hands fixed on the wheel. When we turned off the main road and I saw the sign for Willow Springs Nursing Home, my chest tightened. I laughed nervously. "This can't be right," I said, looking at Daniel. He clenched his jaw and kept driving. The car rolled to a stop in the circular driveway. Melissa twisted in her seat, her smile sharp. "This is where you'll be safe, Margaret." Safe. The word cut me like glass. I shook my head. "Daniel, what is this? Tell me this is a mistake." He stared straight ahead, his knuckles white. Melissa placed a hand on his arm. "Don't back out now. We talked about this. It has to be done." My stomach turned. I reached for the door handle, but Melissa was faster, already stepping out and opening mine. She gestured like I was a child who needed coaxing. "Come on, Margaret, it's for the best." I felt my body stiffen. For the best. On Mother's Day of all days. I turned to Daniel one last time. "Son, look at me. Please." He met my eyes for a split second, full of something that looked like shame, then dropped his gaze to the pavement. The receptionist was waiting with a clipboard as if they had been notified ahead of time. Melissa handed her a folder thick with papers. Power of attorney forms, medical reports. I caught a glimpse of a signature at the bottom of one sheet. My own name shaky, but I knew I had never signed it. My throat went dry. Daniel tried to take my hand, but Melissa's voice sliced between us. "Just let them handle it, Dan. She knows it's for the best." I stumbled inside, the smell of disinfectant wrapping around me. Wheelchairs lined the hallway, televisions blaring. A nurse guided me toward a small room with beige walls and a single window facing a brick wall. My suitcase sat by the bed. My suitcase. Melissa must have gone through my house packing without my knowledge. I bent down and opened it. My nightgown, My family photo albums, even my old journal had been stuffed inside. My phone was missing. I turned back toward the doorway. Daniel stood behind Melissa, silent, his shoulders hunched. Melissa's lips curved in a smile that felt colder than the air conditioning blowing through the vents. That was when it sank in. On the very day meant to honor mothers, my own child had brought me here, not out of love, but obedience to his wife. I felt my knees weaken, my hands trembling on the edge of the bed. My voice came out barely above a whisper. This isn't a gift. This is an execution. The words hung heavy in the room. Daniel's eyes flickered, but he said nothing. Melissa turned and walked down the hallway, her heels clicking against the linoleum. The door shut softly, leaving me standing in a place I had never imagined for myself, my chest hollow, my mind racing, and the carnations in their thin plastic wrap, already wilting in the vase on the dresser. The door shut behind them, and I stood frozen, the carnations drooping in the corner like witnesses to my downfall. A nurse with tired eyes motioned for me to follow her down the hall. I walked stiffly, clutching the strap of my purse, though I knew it held nothing now. At the reception desk, Melissa was leaning forward, her voice brisk, her manicured hand tapping the papers she had brought. I caught sight of the bold letters across the top. Power of attorney. My name beneath in a signature I did not recognize as my own. Next to it, a report signed by Dr. Stephen Lewis, a neurologist I had never met, declaring evidence of memory decline, recommending supervised living. The words blurred, but the signature was clear. Daniel stood slightly behind his wife, his face pale, lips pressed together. For a fleeting second, our eyes met. I wanted to shout, to demand he explain how my life had been reduced to a stack of forgeries, but my voice refused to come. Melissa glanced at him, her whisper sharp but audible. Don't hesitate, Dan. We agreed. She's not safe alone. I almost laughed. Not safe. As if the woman who had balanced bills, raised a son alone after her husband died, and never missed a shift at the hospital was suddenly incapable of making her own breakfast. The receptionist nodded politely, sliding the papers into a folder, her expression careful. She looked at me like I was already one of their residents, not a mother being discarded. The nurse guided me further down the hall until we reached a small room near the back. The air smelled of bleach. The walls were a dull cream, the window facing nothing but brick. On the bed sat my suitcase. I reached for it and unzipped it with trembling hands. Inside were my things, folded roughly, photo albums bent, my nightgown, wrinkled, even my late husband's watch tossed in the corner, and at the bottom where my phone should have been, there was nothing. I spun toward the doorway. Melissa was standing there, arms crossed, her smile faint and hard. Daniel lingered a step behind, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Where is my phone? I asked, my voice low but steady. Melissa tilted her head as though speaking to a stubborn child. It was confusing you, Margaret. Daniel agreed it was better this way. I turned to my son. Daniel, tell me that isn't true. Tell me you didn't take my phone. His eyes darted away, his lips moving as if he might speak, but Melissa's hand touched his arm, and he said nothing. The nurse cleared her throat softly and stepped into the room. She pointed at the bed and said it would be mine. She asked if I wanted to change into slippers or rest before dinner. I shook my head, unable to form an answer. My chest felt like it might collapse. Melissa gave the room one last glance and then looked at Daniel. Let's go. Wait. I said, my voice sharper than I expected. You cannot just leave me here. I am not sick. I am not incompetent. Melissa's expression did not change. She pulled Daniel by the elbow. "This is what's best," she said over her shoulder as if reading from a script. And then they were gone. The hallway swallowed them. I ran to the window and watched the car pull away, Daniel behind the wheel, Melissa in the passenger seat, their silhouettes shrinking until there was nothing left but the echo of tires against asphalt. The room grew impossibly quiet. I sat on the edge of the bed, my coat still buttoned, staring at the battered suitcase that had been packed without my consent. My hands shook as I opened the albums, seeing pictures of Daniel as a boy, birthday cakes, scraped knees, graduation robes. He had once clung to me like his life depended on it. Now he had let his wife write me out of his own. The nurse came back in with a tray, a glass of water, a small plate of meatloaf and peas that smelled of overcooked vegetables. She set it on the table and gave me a kind smile. "Try to eat, sweetheart. It will help you settle in." I nodded without looking at her. The door closed again. I sat there with the tray untouched, the carnations wilting in their thin vase, and the knowledge that everything I thought was mine, even my voice, had been stripped away with a few signatures. That night, I lay on the too-firm mattress staring at the ceiling. My ears picked up the distant hum of televisions and the shuffle of nurses' shoes. My body would not rest. In the darkness, I reached for the nightstand instinctively where my phone should have been. My hand closed on empty air. Somewhere down the hall, a resident coughed. Another muttered in her sleep. I curled beneath the thin blanket, my heart aching in a way no doctor could measure. On the very day meant to honor mothers, I had been declared irrelevant. And as the hours dragged on, I realized the worst wound was not Melissa's cruelty, but Daniel's silence. The first night inside Willow Springs was heavy with smells I could not escape. The air carried disinfectant so strong it seemed to crawl into my throat, mixed with the bland odor of reheated meals drifting from the common room. From my bed, I could hear televisions blaring down the hall, voices rising and falling, laughter from sitcoms played too loud. Every sound reminded me I was not in my home, but in a place where people were left to fade quietly. A nurse wheeled in another woman close to midnight. She was thin, gray-haired, her body bent slightly, as if the years had folded her spine. They introduced her as Doris, my roommate. She lowered herself into the other bed with effort, sighing as though she carried the weight of a lifetime. We exchanged a glance. She offered a faint smile, then pulled a thin blanket up to her chin. The hours dragged. I lay awake staring at the ceiling tiles, counting them over and over. Doris began to snore soft at first, then louder, a rhythm that echoed in the small room. At one point, she mumbled in her sleep. I caught fragments. Words about her daughter not calling. About a son who moved to Arizona and never came back. In the morning over watery oatmeal, she told me plainly, "They left me here 5 years ago. Promised they would visit. I haven't seen them since." Her voice carried no anger, only resignation. The words settled into me like stones. I looked at my tray untouched and thought of Daniel, of Melissa's firm hand on his arm guiding him like a puppet. My son who once begged for second helpings of pancakes, who cried into my chest after losing his first baseball game, had now signed me into this place and taken my phone. I wondered if one day he would even remember where I was. The days blurred together, a pattern of meals and television, the squeak of rubber soles on polished floors, the occasional sound of someone crying out down the corridor. The staff were kind in the way people are kind to children, gentle voices and pet names. Sweetheart, dear, honey. Each word was a reminder that they did not see me as Margaret Taylor, a woman who once managed hospital shifts and household bills, but as another old woman waiting to be forgotten. At night, my mind would not rest. Memories came back sharper in the silence. I saw Daniel in college calling me late at night, asking for money to cover rent, always promising to pay me back. I remembered draining my savings to keep him afloat when he lost his job, believing in him more than he believed in himself. I remembered Melissa's tight smile the first time we met, her polished nails tapping on her wine glass as she asked what I planned to do once I retired. Her tone was light, but her eyes sharp, already calculating. I should have noticed sooner how she looked at me like I was an obstacle. Whenever Daniel asked for help, Melissa stayed silent, her expression cool, her mouth pressed thin. Once, when I handed him a check to cover his car repairs, she muttered under her breath that I was enabling him. I pretended not to hear, but the sting stayed with me. Now I realized she had been waiting for this moment to prove I was unnecessary, to push me out of the picture completely. On the third night, when sleep again refused to come, a young nurse entered quietly to check vitals. She moved with a kind of calm energy, her braids pinned neatly under her cap, her hands steady. She smiled at me not the way others did, but with real warmth. Her name badge read, Ruby Carter. She pressed the cuff around my arm, watching the monitor. Then she leaned closer, her voice low enough only I could hear. "You don't belong here." The words startled me. My chest tightened as if I had been holding my breath for days. I blinked, unsure I had heard correctly. Ruby gave a small smile, her eyes meeting mine with a knowing look. "Don't get me wrong," she whispered. "Plenty of folks need help here, and that's okay. But you don't seem lost." For the first time since stepping into Willow Springs, I felt seen. Not as a patient chart, not as a burden, but as a person. I wanted to reach out to grab her hand, to tell her everything, but my throat ached with unspoken words. Ruby squeezed my wrist gently before letting go. "Get some rest, Margaret. Tomorrow will look brighter." She left as quietly as she had come, the door closing softly behind her. I lay back against the pillow, listening to Doris's snores and the faint buzz of the hallway lights. Ruby's words echoed in my mind long after she was gone. "You don't belong here." For the first time since Mother's Day, I felt a flicker of something I thought I had lost forever. Hope. The next morning, Ruby returned with a clipboard in her hand and a tired smile that did not quite hide the shadows under her eyes. She checked my pulse, scribbled something on the chart, then sat down on the chair beside my bed as if she had been waiting for the chance. She told me her grandmother had once been placed in a nursing home against her will, the same way I had. Her own children had claimed she was forgetful, unsteady, a danger to herself. Ruby had been in high school then, powerless to change anything, forced to watch, as her grandmother's house was sold and the bank account drained. Her voice grew softer when she said that was the reason she had become a nurse. She hated seeing families strip dignity and money away from the people who raised them. I felt my throat tighten. Her story was so familiar, it was like hearing an echo of my own. She placed her hand gently over mine and said she could see I was not confused, that I was sharper than most of the staff wanted to admit. It was the first time in days that someone treated me like I was still myself. Later that afternoon, Ruby returned carrying a grocery bag. She slipped inside quickly, glancing over her shoulder to make sure no one was watching. She whispered that she could give me a few minutes on one of the old desktops in the lounge if I promised to keep it quiet. My heart beat fast at the thought of touching a keyboard again, of searching for answers. We waited until the hallway was clear. Then she guided me past the common room, her steps quick and sure. She sat me down in front of a dusty monitor and booted it up. My fingers shook as I typed the name on the report Melissa had filed. Dr. Stephen Lewis. A few entries popped up almost immediately. Neurology practice in downtown Columbus articles, photos from medical conferences, and then a picture of him shaking hands at a charity event. Standing next to him was Melissa, her smile wide, her hand resting on his arm like they were old friends. I felt my stomach churn. The report that said I was losing my memory had been signed by a man tied directly to my daughter-in-law. I scrolled further and found that Melissa had served as a board member at a fundraiser he had sponsored the year before. The realization settled heavy on me. The document declaring I was unfit had not come from medical concern. It had come from manipulation. I sat back, the cursor blinking on the screen, my chest rising and falling too fast. Ruby leaned over my shoulder, saw the picture, and let out a slow breath. She placed her hand on my arm. "This isn't the end," she said quietly. "You just need to keep your mind strong and stay patient." I nodded, though the weight in my chest made it hard to breathe. She reached into the grocery bag she carried and pulled out a small envelope, handing it to me with a half smile. She said she had stopped at a convenience store on her way in and bought a handful of lottery tickets for her cousins. One was left over a bright slip of paper stamped Mother's Day Special across the top. She held it out to me and whispered that sometimes the world gave small chances when we least expected them. I laughed softly, though it sounded brittle. After everything that had been taken from me, the idea of a lottery ticket felt absurd. Still, I took it from her hand. The paper crinkled between my fingers, light and flimsy, but for some reason I could not let it go. Ruby winked and said I should hide it somewhere safe. Even a small hope was worth guarding. She straightened her scrubs, tucked the clipboard under her arm, and told me she would check on me again later. When she left, I stared at the ticket for a long time, torn between disbelief and a strange flicker of curiosity. I folded it carefully and slipped it inside the pocket of my nightgown. Then I lay back on the bed, listening to Doris's snores and the hum of televisions down the hall, holding on to that thin piece of paper as if it carried more than numbers, as if it carried a sliver of freedom. That night I could not sleep. The ticket weighed against my chest like a secret too heavy for such thin paper. I waited until Doris's snores filled the room and the hallway lights dimmed to their night setting. Quietly, I slipped from my bed, pulled on my sweater, and crept toward the common lounge. The old computer sat in the corner, humming faintly, its screensaver glowing blue. My hands shook as I typed in the Ohio Lottery website, each key louder than it should have been in the silence. I unfolded the ticket, the words "Mother's Day Special" bright across the top, and carefully entered the numbers. For a second the page refreshed, and I thought maybe it had frozen. Then the screen lit with the winning sequence. My breath caught in my throat. I checked once, twice, 3 times, tracing each digit with my trembling finger. Every number matched. The prize line read $20 million. My knees almost gave out beneath me. I clamped my hand over my mouth to stifle the sound that wanted to escape. My chest pounded so hard I thought it might draw the nurse from down the hall. $20 million. My whole body trembled. A laugh rose but turned into a sob halfway. Joy tangled with fear until I could not tell which was stronger. I imagined Melissa's face if she knew. She would never let me keep it. She would twist the papers she already had used the fake reports and claim the money in Daniel's name. The thought chilled me. My son had already let her take my freedom. He would not hesitate to take my fortune. I printed the confirmation slip, folded it tight, and tucked it deep inside my bra. My fingers ached from clenching it. I returned to my room, crawled under the blanket, and lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, the ticket pressing against my skin like a promise and a threat. The next day, I could not keep still. Every clink of the food cart, every shuffle of shoes outside my door made my heart leap with panic. Doris noticed squinting at me between spoonfuls of oatmeal. "You look like you saw a ghost," she muttered. I forced a smile and told her I just did not sleep well. Ruby came in mid-morning, her eyes sharp as if she sensed something had shifted. She closed the door quietly and asked if I was all right. I pulled her aside, my voice barely a whisper, and told her what had happened. Her eyes widened, but she did not gasp or laugh. She just placed her hand firmly over mine. "We need to keep this very quiet," she said. "If Melissa catches wind of it, she will come after you harder than before." I nodded, the weight of truth settling deeper. Ruby leaned in and whispered that she knew someone who could help. A volunteer attorney who came twice a month to Willow Springs, specializing in cases like mine. His name was Aaron Mitchell. She promised she would set up a meeting. The hours crawled until Friday. My heart thudded in my chest each time the automatic doors opened in the lobby. At last, Ruby appeared at my doorway, her face lit with purpose. She told me Aaron had arrived and was waiting in the small break room near the staff lockers. I followed her, my palms damp, clutching the folded slip of paper like it was my last anchor. Aaron was younger than I expected, maybe late 30s, with a steady gaze and a voice that carried calm authority. He greeted me with respect, not pity, and waited for me to sit before he spoke. Ruby closed the door behind us. I slid the printed confirmation across the table, my fingers trembling. "Can you help me disappear?" I asked, the words spilling out before I lost my nerve. He studied the paper, then looked at me, his eyes steady. "We will need to move fast," he said. "Very fast." For the next hour, he outlined steps I barely understood. Legal transfers, blind trusts, temporary mailing addresses, paperwork that would shield my name from anyone who tried to claim my prize. He spoke of setting up protections so that even if Melissa or Daniel went to court, they would hit nothing but walls. He explained it all with a calm certainty that steadied my breath. I signed where he pointed, my hand still shaking, and each signature felt like a thread cutting me free. Ruby stood close the entire time, her presence a quiet reassurance. When it was done, Aaron gathered the papers into a neat folder and told me we had just taken the first step toward my freedom. That night back in my narrow bed, I lay awake not with dread, but with something I had almost forgotten. Resolve. For the first time since Daniel drove me to Willow Springs, I felt the faint outline of a future that was mine. The fear was still there, but beneath it ran a current of strength, humming steady, reminding me that even inside locked doors, my life was not over yet. Aaron returned 2 days later, his folder thicker than before, his expression calm but serious. He asked Ruby to keep watch by the door and then laid the documents out on the small table between us. His voice was steady as he explained how we would build a blind trust, a legal shell that would hide my winnings from anyone trying to trace them. The money would never appear under Margaret Taylor. Instead, it would flow into accounts under the name of a trust invisible to Melissa and Daniel, unreachable by the courts unless I allowed it. I listened carefully, forcing myself to stay focused, though the words swirled like a foreign language. He spoke of setting up a new bank account in Knoxville, Tennessee, far enough from Columbus that no one from Melissa's circle would stumble across it. He told me he had already identified a modest brick house outside the city tucked in a quiet neighborhood with wide trees and neighbors who minded their own business. As he described the details, my chest grew lighter. The idea of leaving Willow Springs no longer felt like a dream. It was becoming a plan sharp and real. But then his tone shifted low and firm. He leaned closer, his eyes locking with mine. Melissa will not let go. People like her never do. She will push harder, use every trick she knows. If you hesitate even for a moment, she will own your freedom again. The words landed heavy. My stomach tightened at the thought of Melissa's cold smile, the way she had guided Daniel's silence like pulling strings on a puppet. I closed my eyes and remembered the carnations in their cheap plastic wrap, the forged papers, the sound of the car door shutting on Mother's Day. I opened them again and looked Aaron straight in the face. I will not hesitate. Not anymore. We spent hours going over signatures, notarizations, and steps I had never imagined I would need in my life. Ruby brought coffee once, her eyes warm with encouragement, and left us alone again. When the last page was signed, Aaron stacked the papers, neatly tapped them into place, and said we were ready. He promised to handle the logistics, quietly moving funds, arranging the purchase, and preparing transportation when the time was right. All I needed was patience and resolve. That evening, I returned to my room and found Doris already asleep, her soft snore filling the silence. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the suitcase in the corner, the same suitcase Melissa had packed without asking. This time, it would not be a symbol of my captivity, but of my escape. My hands rested on my knees, steady for the first time in weeks. 2 nights later, I was walking past the nurse's station when I heard a voice that froze me in place. Melissa's. She was on the phone, her tone smooth and amused. I pressed myself against the wall, listening as her words drifted down the corridor. Don't worry, she said, a light laugh escaping her lips. In a few weeks, she will sign everything. Daniel's too soft to stop me. She chuckled again, sharp and cruel. She doesn't even realize how easy this is going to be. My breath caught in my throat. She was planning more, setting her sights on what little I had left, certain she could force me to surrender. Heat spread through my chest, not just fear, but anger deep and steady. I stepped back before she noticed me and hurried to my room, my heart pounding like a drum. That night, I sat awake on the mattress, the glow of the hallway light slipping under the door. In my hand, I held the folded confirmation slip of the lottery numbers, the ink smudged at the edges from being handled so often. Melissa thought she was weeks away from owning me. She had no idea I was days away from vanishing. The thought steadied me. I pressed the paper to my chest, whispering a vow into the silence. She will never win. The wheels of my freedom were already turning, and I was ready to walk through the first open door. Before the first light touched the windows, Ruby slipped into my room, carrying a small duffel bag. She laid it quietly on the bed and told me everything inside was mine now. A pair of jeans, a plain gray sweater, sneakers, and a jacket that would not draw attention. I dressed quickly, my heart pounding in my ears. She pressed a bus schedule into my hand and whispered that Aaron had arranged everything. The trust had purchased a house in Knoxville under a new name. All I had to do was get there. The hallways were still only the faint buzz of fluorescent lights breaking the silence. Ruby walked with me until the side exit, her keys jingling softly. She hugged me once fiercely as though she were holding her own grandmother. Then she turned the lock and the door clicked open. Cold air rushed in. My chest ached with fear and hope tangled together. I stepped outside the duffel slung over my shoulder and walked quickly across the empty lot toward the road. My legs felt like they might buckle, but I kept moving. At the bus stop, I sat on the metal bench, clutching the strap of my bag, eyes darting at every passing car. When the bus finally arrived, I climbed aboard and sank into a seat near the back. The ride out of Columbus was long and quiet, the landscape changing from flat highways to the rolling hills of southern Ohio. By the time the bus pulled into Knoxville that evening, the sky was streaked with pink and gold. Aaron met me at a small station, his car parked discreetly along the curb. He drove me through winding neighborhoods until we reached a quiet street lined with maple trees. My new home stood near the end. A one-story brick house, modest but solid, with a crooked mailbox leaning toward the road. Inside the house smelled faintly of fresh paint. The furniture was simple: a couch, a table, a bed neatly made. There was no clutter, no family photographs, only silence waiting to be filled. Aaron handed me a key and told me everything was in order. The trust had closed on the property 2 days earlier. He promised to keep checking in, but urged me to stay low, keep movements minimal, and trust no one outside our circle. When he left, I walked slowly from room to room, touching the cool walls, the smooth kitchen counter, the window ledges. For the first time since Mother's Day, I was not surrounded by bleach and locked doors. That night I sat on the porch wrapped in a quilt, listening to the wind rustle through the leaves. Freedom felt both terrifying and fragile, as though one wrong move could shatter it. The days passed quietly. I cooked small meals, wrote notes in a journal, and checked the mailbox at the end of the driveway. I bought a small fireproof box and hid it beneath a loose floorboard in the hallway closet. Inside I placed the lottery ticket, the confirmation slip, and every document Aaron had given me. Each time I closed the box, I felt a sliver of reassurance, though my hands always lingered on the lid longer than necessary. One afternoon, restless, I set up an old laptop Aaron had provided. Using a fake name and a fresh profile, I logged onto Facebook. The first thing I searched was my son. Daniel's page appeared almost instantly, his face smiling in the profile picture, Melissa by his side. My throat tightened as I clicked. His most recent post nearly split me in two. A picture of me from years ago, smiling at a birthday table, Daniel's arm wrapped around my shoulder. The caption read, "If anyone has seen my mother, Margaret Taylor, please contact me or the Columbus police. She has been missing for days. We are desperate to find her." The comments poured in beneath, people praising him as a devoted son. Strangers sending prayers telling him to stay strong, admiring his dedication. I stared at the screen until my vision blurred. My body shook with anger and grief, and before I knew it, tears spilled freely down my cheeks. The world believed his performance while the truth rotted in silence. I closed the laptop and pressed my hands to my face. The sound that came out of me was half sob, half bitter laugh. To them, he was a hero. To me, he was the boy who had abandoned his mother on Mother's Day and never looked back. Later that evening, still restless, I searched through an old email account I had not touched in months. I scrolled through messages I had almost forgotten about. One folder caught my attention, filled with scanned medical bills and insurance notices. As I clicked through, a pattern began to appear. Dr. Stephen Lewis's name repeated again and again. At first on legitimate invoices, then on suspicious forms that did not match any appointments I remembered. In the attachments were email chains showing Melissa copied in casual notes about coordinating schedules, discussing details that had nothing to do with me, but everything to do with building a file against me. My pulse raced as I scrolled further. One message included a draft report nearly identical to the one Melissa had submitted at Willow Springs, only with corrections marked in her handwriting. I sat back staring at the screen. The evidence was here buried in my own forgotten invoice. I printed the documents with a small portable printer Aaron someone had left for me, slid them into a folder, and placed them inside the fireproof box. My hands trembled as I closed the lid. The proof was growing. Melissa was not only ruthless, but deliberate, and Dr. Lewis had been her willing accomplice. I lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slowly above me. Outside, the crickets sang in the dark, steady and indifferent. I clutched the quilt to my chest, torn between fear and determination. The world saw Daniel as a dutiful son. Melissa was already weaving lies deeper than I had realized. But I had the ticket, the documents, and a house no one knew about. The game they thought they were winning was only just beginning, and for the first time, I felt the stirrings of strength rise louder than the silence of my tears. The next morning, I woke with a weight pressing against my chest. Sleep had been shallow, broken by dreams of Richard shaking his head, pointing at papers I could never quite read. I rose before the sun brewed coffee in the small kitchen and pulled out the worn cardboard box of documents I had carried since his death. For years I had avoided looking too closely, telling myself grief was heavy enough without digging into numbers and contracts. But now I knew better. Melissa's fingerprints were everywhere, and I had to see how deep the damage went. I spread the folders across the table, the paper edges curling from age. Some were simple things, insurance forms and bank statements, but buried near the bottom was a folder labeled Taylor Catering, LLC. My hand stilled. That small catering company was the dream Richard and I had built in the early years of our marriage. We had run it from our garage, cooking for weddings and community events, until his hospital job took over and we let the company go dormant. We never closed the LLC, just left it to gather dust. As I scanned the papers, my stomach dropped. There were loan documents dated 2 years after Richard had died. A line of credit for $750,000 had been opened under Taylor Catering, LLC, signed by Richard's hand. I knew instantly the signature was forged. The loops of the R were too perfect, the tail of the Y stretched unnaturally. My hands shook as I traced the lines, my breath catching in my throat. Melissa had used my husband's name, his ghost, to steal nearly $1 million. I flipped through the pages, faster bile rising in my throat. Payments had been made for a while, then default notices began stacking up. Whoever had filed the paperwork knew exactly what they were doing. They had hidden the trail through shell accounts and bounced payments, keeping it quiet until the debt ballooned. Richard must have known something before he died. I remembered nights when he sat at the kitchen table, his shoulders tense, shoving bills into a folder when I walked into the room. He told me it was nothing, just extra work stress. Now I understood. He had been covering for our son's wife and her schemes, swallowing the shame until it swallowed him. My eyes blurred with tears, but anger burned hotter than grief. Melissa had been weaving this web for years, and Daniel either looked away or let himself be pulled into it. My husband's name had been dragged through mud, and I had been left in a brick room at Willow Springs, stripped of dignity. The rage steadied my hands. I gathered every forged page, every suspicious note, and scanned them into digital files. That afternoon, I sat at my laptop, my heart pounding as I drafted a letter. I addressed it to the Department of Justice, the Elder Justice Division. I explained in plain words that I was submitting evidence of financial exploitation, forgery, and elder abuse. I attached the scanned files, labeled them carefully, and pressed send before I could second-guess myself. The moment the screen confirmed the upload, I leaned back, trembling with a mix of fear and relief. My story was no longer locked inside me. 3 days later, a plain envelope appeared in my mailbox. Inside was a single sheet of paper with the DOJ seal at the top and the name Frank Cooper, Special Agent. The letter was short. He confirmed receipt of my documents and stated that an official case file had been opened for review. If more evidence came forward, I was to send it directly to his secure address. I read the words over and over, my pulse quickening. The silence was breaking. Someone beyond my walls finally knew the truth. Around the same time, I noticed chatter online shifting. I logged into my false Facebook account and searched local Columbus news. An article appeared questioning the timeline of my disappearance. Why had Daniel waited days before reporting me missing? Why were there inconsistencies between his story and witness accounts at Willow Springs? My face was blurred in the photo, but the story was unmistakably mine. Comments buzzed beneath the article. Some still called Daniel a devoted son. Others whispered doubts, asking why my daughter-in-law Melissa never spoke publicly, why the medical reports were sealed. The first cracks were forming in the image Melissa had built. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, the phone Aaron had given me buzzed with a number I did not recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something told me to answer. A woman's voice introduced herself as Clara Jensen, a reporter from the Knoxville Herald. She said she had seen the DOJ docket update and the Columbus chatter, and she wanted to hear my side when I was ready. She promised no names would be used without my consent. Her tone was firm but gentle, and I could tell she had already guessed more than she was saying. I thanked her for reaching out but told her I was not ready to speak yet. Not until I had everything lined up, not until Melissa's lies could be burned away in one strike. Clara respected that. She gave me her number and said the story would wait for me. After I hung up, I sat by the window staring out at the quiet street. Children rode bikes past the crooked mailbox, their laughter ringing into the warm air. My hands still trembled as I folded the DOJ letter and slid it into the fireproof box with the rest of my evidence. The walls of the trap Melissa had built around me were cracking, but I knew better than to celebrate. This was only the beginning. As night fell, I lit a single lamp and sat at the kitchen table with Richard's old watch beside me. I whispered to him in the silence. She thought she buried me, but I am still here, and now the world will know what she has done. The envelope arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, tucked between a utility bill and a grocery flyer. My hands trembled as soon as I saw the courthouse seal on the corner. I carried it inside, sat at the kitchen table, and slid a knife carefully along the top. Inside was a thick stack of papers. A petition had been filed in Franklin County Probate Court. Melissa's name was at the top, her attorney's signature at the bottom. The request was chilling in its simplicity. They were asking the court to declare me mentally incapacitated and to grant full guardianship to my son. Attached were documents meant to prove their case. A psychiatric evaluation signed by Dr. Stephen Lewis, dated only 2 months prior, though I had never once been in his office. A packet of audio recording snippets of my voice from old voicemails spliced and cut until I sounded confused, paranoid, unstable. One message played in my head as I read the transcript, my voice asking Daniel why he had not returned my call, then muttering that I was worried someone was taking my things. In truth, that call had been from the week my purse was stolen at the supermarket. Now it was presented as evidence of dementia. I pressed my hand hard against my chest, forcing myself to breathe slowly. My eyes moved down the page until they landed on Daniel's signature. He had signed the petition confirming his agreement with Melissa's attorney. I closed my eyes, the paper crinkling in my grip. In the silence of the kitchen, I pictured him pen in hand, his fingers hesitating just before he wrote his name. I could almost see his jaw tightening the way it always did when he was torn. Daniel had never been cruel on his own. He was weak, pliable, always bending to Melissa's will. I imagined her standing over him, her manicured hand resting on his shoulder, pressing him down until he signed. The thought brought no comfort. His name was still there in ink, black and final. I flipped through the final page. The court had scheduled a competency hearing in 3 weeks. I was to appear in person to prove I was capable of managing my own affairs. The words blurred as I stared. They were dragging me back into the light, not to recognize me, but to erase me completely. I stood and paced the kitchen, clutching the papers so tight the edges cut into my palm. My mind raced. Melissa had built this case for months, maybe years. Dr. Lewis was her puppet. Daniel was her shield. The recordings were her weapon. And now the law itself was her stage. My phone buzzed on the counter. It was Aaron. I answered with my voice shaking. He spoke calmly, telling me he had already seen the filing that the court's electronic system made it public. He promised we would fight back, that the evidence I had gathered, the DOJ acknowledgement, the forged documents, all of it would weigh heavily in my favor. I wanted to believe him, but fear still curled cold in my stomach. This was not just about papers, it was about perception. Melissa was clever. She knew how to play the role of the concerned daughter-in-law, the woman sacrificing her time to protect an aging mother. Daniel would stand beside her, his head bowed, his voice shaking with rehearsed sincerity. And I would be painted as the ungrateful, unstable woman lashing out against her only family. That night I could not eat. I sat at the table staring at the folded petition, my hands resting against the wood. Doris's voice came back to me, her words about children who leave their parents behind without a backward glance. I realized I was about to stand in front of a judge and face the very people who had stolen my freedom once already. I walked to the closet, pulled the fireproof box from under the floorboard, and placed the petition inside with the lottery ticket and all the evidence I had collected. Then I knelt on the floor, my hands pressed against the lid, whispering to Richard's memory. They think they can bury me again. But I will not let them. When I finally rose, the house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant bark of a dog outside. I stood at the window staring at the dark street and felt the weight of what was coming settle over me. The battle was no longer hidden. The war had stepped into the open, and there was no turning back. The morning of the hearing rose sharp and cold sunlight glinting against the windows of the Franklin County Courthouse. I clutched Aaron's arm as we walked through the wide stone steps, trying to steady the tremor in my hands. The weight of the summons I had received days before sat heavy in my purse, as if it still radiated the threat printed across it. This was no longer quiet manipulation behind closed doors. It was the law itself being bent against me, and I would have to fight for the right to call myself whole. Inside the courtroom hummed with a low murmur of voices. Families gathered for other cases, attorneys shuffled papers, and the clerk called names in a rhythm that made my chest tighten. Melissa was already there at the petitioner's table. She wore a dark dress and a pale cardigan that softened her outline. Her makeup subtle, her hair carefully smoothed. A folded tissue sat in her palm. It was clear she had rehearsed the role of grieving caretaker. Daniel stood beside her, his tie crooked, his face pale. His hands fidgeted, opening and closing as if he wanted to hide them under the table. When the judge entered, the room fell into silence, broken only by the scrape of chairs as everyone rose. Judge Robert King had the look of a man who had listened to too many family betrayals. He asked the clerk to call the case, and Melissa's attorney stood his voice rich and practiced. He painted a picture of a confused older woman incapable of managing her affairs. He said I had become paranoid, forgetful, and prone to losing track of simple tasks. He lifted Dr. Stephen Lewis's report and waved it as if it were the word of Scripture. Then he pressed play on a small recording device. The courtroom filled with my own voice pulled from an old voicemail. I heard myself ask Daniel why he had not called back. Then I muttered about someone taking my things, but the attorney had cut the call, so it ended abruptly, stripped of context. It was the week my purse had been stolen at the grocery store, but no one hearing that clip would know. To them, it sounded like confusion. Melissa dabbed her eyes with her tissue, careful not to smudge her mascara. She said in a trembling voice that she loved me like her own mother. She said she had begged Daniel to step in because she was terrified I would burn the house down by leaving the stove on. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his lips pressed tight, his eyes fixed on the floor. When they finished, Aaron rose slowly the way a man rises knowing the ground beneath him is solid. He presented our exhibits in a calm voice, first laying out the independent evaluation conducted by a psychiatrist in Knoxville. He described the tests, the memory sequences, the clear results. He handed the report to the clerk and asked to call me to the stand. I stood, my knees trembling but my spine straight. The oath felt heavy as I swore it, and then I sat, my hands folded tight in my lap. Aaron asked me simple questions. Where do you live now? How do you manage your bills? What date did Richard die? When is Daniel's birthday? I answered each carefully, making my voice steady, not rushed, not shaky. He asked me to describe Mother's Day at Willow Springs. I spoke of the carnations in plastic wrap of my suitcase already packed, of my phone taken from me. I did not cry. I let the words stand on their own. Melissa's attorney cross-examined me with a sharp smile. He asked if I had ever misplaced my keys. Yes. He asked if I had ever repeated a story, probably like anyone with a full life. He asked if I had ever been confused in public. I told him once after Richard died, I cried in front of the cereal aisle because grief makes every box blur together, and grief is not a diagnosis. The courtroom stirred faintly, a shift I could feel in the air. Aaron objected to the line of questioning, and the judge sustained. When I returned to the table, my chest loosened just enough to breathe. Aaron called the psychiatrist on video a steady woman with sharp eyes. She explained her methods and declared clearly that I showed no sign of dementia or cognitive decline. My executive function was strong, my recall intact. Her words were dry, but to me, they were music. Aaron then presented a photograph. Melissa at a charity gala standing close beside Dr. Lewis on a stage. He followed it with a committee roster listing her as a board member and Dr. Lewis as a sponsor. He asked the court to consider why a neurologist who socialized with the petitioner would file a clinical report without records of an appointment or testing. The judge took his time. He studied the photo, then the report, then the attorney. He asked why the medical declaration lacked basic clinical notes. The attorney stammered about professional discretion, but Judge King raised his hand and cut him off. His voice was firm as he said the court had questions about the integrity of the evidence. He leaned back and announced the guardianship request would not be granted today. He ordered a court-appointed independent evaluation. He required Dr. Lewis's phone logs, office notes, and any correspondence with Melissa. He requested the original audio files for forensic analysis. Until then, my accounts and my person remained my own. The relief hit me like a wave I had not known I was waiting for. My shoulders sagged as if someone had lifted stones off my back. Melissa's face was still arranged in sorrow, but her hand twisted the tissue until it was a rope. Daniel finally looked at me. His eyes were raw, filled with something that looked like shame. For a heartbeat, I thought he might step forward, might break from her grip. Then Melissa touched his arm and he looked away. The judge stood and the bailiff called the next case. The courtroom stirred with the scrape of chairs. Aaron leaned close and whispered that we had held our ground. He said he would file motions that afternoon to secure the evidence. He reminded me not to engage Melissa or Daniel in the hallway. When we stepped into the corridor, the tall windows spilled light across the polished floor, turning the dust into drifting stars. My legs shook with the mix of fear and adrenaline, but my steps were mine. Outside, the cold air bit at my face. Aaron's phone buzzed and he glanced at it. He said quietly, "Our contact at the Department of Justice had confirmed receipt of the expanded file, including the forged LLC loan and the communication trail with Dr. Lewis." I stood on the courthouse steps, watching the traffic stream past on Mound Street. The city moved on with the indifference of 1,000 lives. I closed my eyes for a moment and felt the air sting my skin. This was not the end. Melissa would regroup. She would sharpen her blade and strike again. But for the first time since the carnations and the brick room at Willow Springs, I had felt the balance tilt. The law had not erased me. It had seen me. As Aaron hailed a cab, I held that thought in my chest like a fragile flame, determined to keep it alive for the battles still to come. The courthouse steps still echoed in my chest long after I walked away. Within days, the story had left the walls of Franklin County and spread across headlines like wildfire. Clara Jensen, a seasoned reporter with silver hair that framed her sharp eyes, called Aaron first. She wanted to speak with me directly. At first I hesitated. The thought of my name splashed across the paper filled me with both dread and defiance. Aaron assured me Clara was thorough, careful, and fair. So one morning I found myself sitting across from her at a quiet diner in downtown Columbus, the smell of coffee and bacon thick in the air. She listened intently as I recounted the ordeal, her recorder tucked neatly beside her notepad. I told her about Mother's Day, the carnations, the packed suitcase, the cold brick wall of Willow Springs. I told her about the phone taken from my hands, about Dr. Lewis's forged report, about Melissa's tears in court. My voice never cracked, but my fingers trembled against the ceramic mug. Clara leaned in her eyes, fierce with empathy. She promised she would tell it straight. The article appeared 3 days later on the front page of the Columbus Gazette. The headline read in bold, "Mother's Day betrayal, a son's silence, and a daughter-in-law's scheme." My face was not on the cover, but the details were unmistakable. Clara's words carried weight, describing the legal fight, the questions about Dr. Lewis, and the suspicion of financial abuse. The community began to murmur. Neighbors, church groups, even old co-workers reached out through cautious emails and letters. For the first time, Melissa's carefully polished mask began to crack under the weight of public scrutiny. Meanwhile, the Department of Justice moved quietly but decisively. 2 weeks after the article ran, agents entered Dr. Lewis's office in Westerville. Computers, paper files, and phones were carried out in boxes. Rumors spread quickly. By evening, local news confirmed that both Melissa and Dr. Lewis were under investigation for fraud, conspiracy, and elder abuse. I watched the broadcast from my small living room in Knoxville, the glow of the television casting shadows across my walls. The sight of his office door sealed with evidence tape made my chest swell with a grim relief. Daniel appeared on my porch the next day. His car pulled into the gravel drive slowly as though he feared the house itself might reject him. I almost didn't answer the knock, but something in me needed to see his face. When I opened the door, he stood there with eyes swollen red, his hair unkempt, his suit jacket wrinkled. He asked if he could come in. I stepped aside without a word. He sat on the edge of the couch like a boy in trouble, his hands twisted together until his knuckles turned white. His voice broke when he said Melissa had pushed him into everything, that he never wanted to sign the papers, that she told him it was the only way to keep me safe. He claimed he had been trapped, manipulated, afraid of losing her. I watched him weep, his shoulders shaking with each confession. My heart, stubborn and bruised, wanted to believe him, wanted to reach across the years and pull him back into the boy I once held close. But my silence stretched between us like a canyon. I did not comfort him. I did not absolve him. I let the weight of his choices rest where it belonged. News traveled quickly again. Melissa was arrested late one evening, led away from her suburban home in handcuffs while cameras flashed. She kept her chin high, her expression fixed, but the tremor in her step betrayed her. The footage aired across every local channel, the words scrolling across the bottom of the screen: Melissa Taylor charged with financial exploitation and conspiracy to commit fraud. Daniel was not spared. Within days, his name appeared in connection with supplemental investigations. The DOJ released a statement that he remained under inquiry for signing documents related to fraudulent loans. My chest tightened as I read it, the mixture of vindication and sorrow nearly suffocating. I sat by the window that night, the soft Tennessee air brushing against the curtains. I thought about the years I had poured into raising him, the nights I stayed awake when he was sick, the hours I worked double shifts to pay his tuition. And now here we were. He claimed weakness. She claimed love. And I, left in silence, had chosen strength. When I turned off the lamp and let the room sink into darkness, I realized the story was no longer confined to me. The betrayal had been dragged into the light, and the world was finally beginning to see the truth. The storm had broken, but its aftermath was only just beginning. The courthouse was crowded that winter morning, reporters lined along the marble steps, cameras clicking as I made my way through the doors. I kept my coat buttoned tight against the wind, my hands steady, even as my heart thumped against my ribs. It had been months of waiting, of hearings and depositions of evidence stacked taller than I could have imagined. And now at the end of 2024, the verdict had finally arrived. When the judge read the charges aloud, Melissa stood between her attorneys, her face pale but defiant. Fraud, elder abuse, forgery of power of attorney. Each word rang like a bell inside my chest. The jury had deliberated less than a day before finding her guilty on every count. The sentence was clear: years in prison. No more fine clothes, no more rehearsed tears, no more control. Daniel sat a few rows behind her, his head bowed, his suit crumpled. His own sentence was lighter probation and community service. The court acknowledged Melissa's coercion, but his reputation was ruined. His career collapsed, his friends gone, his name stained. As the gavel fell, I felt an ache sharper than joy. Victory, yes, but wrapped in the sorrow of what had been lost. A son. A family I once believed unbreakable. I stepped out of the courthouse into the gray Ohio sky, and the cold air rushed over me like a baptism. Reporters shouted questions, microphones reaching like grasping hands. I said nothing. Some stories needed no words. The months that followed were quiet, almost too quiet. My assets remained safe within the blind trust Aaron had built. The lottery winnings were intact, but I no longer thought of them as luck. They were a tool, and I intended to use them well. In January, I signed the final paperwork establishing the Margaret Project in downtown Columbus. Its mission was simple but vital: to protect seniors from financial exploitation, to provide legal aid to ensure that no one else would be silenced or erased as I had been. The first office was modest, a brick building near the courthouse staffed by a handful of young attorneys and volunteers. We opened a hotline, and calls began pouring in from all across the state. Stories of stolen pensions, forged signatures, sons and daughters who thought age meant weakness. Each voice reminded me that my pain was not mine alone. When spring came, I returned to Willow Springs for the first time since I had slipped away in the early morning hours. The parking lot was the same, the red maple trees lining the entrance bare against the pale sky, but inside the halls gleamed brighter. The staff greeted me with cautious smiles, and Ruby rushed forward, her arms open wide. We embraced tightly, and I felt a warmth I had almost forgotten. She whispered that the changes I set in motion had reached them, that oversight had improved, that residents felt seen again. She led me into the activity room where rows of folding chairs had been set up. Dozens of residents gathered, their eyes fixed on me. Some faces I remembered, others were new. I stood before them, my hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of their attention. I spoke from the heart. I told them we are not burdens, we are not invisible, we are not finished. I reminded them that every wrinkle, every scar, every memory carried value. My voice wavered only once when I said that love should never be weaponized to control, and that dignity is not something anyone has the right to take. The applause began softly, then grew louder, echoing through the hall. Some wiped tears, others nodded firmly. Ruby smiled, her eyes shining. Later, as I walked through the familiar corridors, I paused at the small room where I had once sat on the edge of a bed, my suitcase beside me, carnations wilting in their wrap. The walls were painted a brighter color now, the window dressed with new curtains. But I could still feel the ghost of that moment, the sting of betrayal pressed into the air. I closed the door gently and whispered to myself that it was no longer my prison. At home in Knoxville, I found myself at peace for the first time in years. My cat curled on the arm of the chair, the fire crackled in the hearth, and I held a stack of letters in my lap. They came from strangers, from men and women who had read Clara's article or seen the trial coverage. Some shared their own stories of betrayal, others simply wrote, "Thank you." I answered each one slowly, my pen steady, my words careful. When the Margaret Project held its first fundraising gala, I stood on the stage in a simple navy dress. The room was filled with allies, lawyers, advocates, seniors who had fought their own battles. I looked out at their faces and felt something stronger than triumph. It was renewal. My story had not ended in silence. It had grown into a chorus. The past would always ache. Daniel had not visited again. His absence was both a wound and a kind of closure. Melissa sat behind bars, her appeals denied. Dr. Lewis lost his license, his name disgraced. Justice had come imperfect but undeniable. That winter night, as snow began to fall gently outside my window, I set up the small camera Aaron had given me. I wanted my final words not just written in a court record, but spoken directly to anyone who needed them. I pressed record and sat quietly for a moment, the hum of the heater filling the silence. Then I lifted my chin and looked into the lens. Have you ever been treated like your worth had expired, like you were nothing more than a burden? Have you ever been pushed aside, silenced, or erased? If you have, I want you to know this. You are not finished. Your voice matters. Share your story because it is not just yours. It belongs to all of us who refuse to be forgotten. I let the words hang there, then leaned forward and clicked the camera off. The room was still, the snow fell outside, and for the first time in a long time, I felt completely free.